You feel your body change long before anyone explains why. Your hips widen. Your walk shifts. Something in your skeleton is rearranging itself for a job it has been preparing for since before you were born. Nobody hands you a manual for this. For a woman walking across the African savanna 60,000 years ago, this same reshaping had already been happening for millions of years. It was written into bone. This isn't a story about romance or myths about clubs and cave dragging. This is a story about one of the strangest, most dangerous trade-offs evolution ever made, and about the people who had to step in to fix it. Here's the trade-off. Around 6 million years ago, our ancestors stood upright. Walking on two legs meant a narrower pelvis, because a wide one makes bipedal walking inefficient. But brains were also getting bigger, much bigger. So you have a shrinking birth canal and a growing head trying to pass through it. What happens when biology gives you two demands that can't both be satisfied? Anthropologists Wenda Trevathan and Karen Rosenberg have spent decades studying exactly this collision. They call it the obstetrical dilemma. In plain terms, it means human childbirth is a tight, high-stakes squeeze that most other primates simply don't face, because most other primates aren't walking upright with oversized infant skulls. Not every researcher agrees on why the squeeze exists. Biologist Holly Dunsworth published an alternative case in 2012, arguing the real limit isn't pelvis width at all, but energy. A mother's metabolism can only support a fetus growing so large before her own body runs out of fuel to sustain the pregnancy. Under this view, babies are born relatively undeveloped, not because the pelvis physically won't allow more growth, but because keeping them inside any longer would cost the mother too much. Researchers are still split on which explanation carries more weight, and the honest answer is probably some mix of both. What isn't in dispute is the result. Human infants are born earlier, in developmental terms, than almost any other primate. A newborn chimpanzee can cling to its mother's fur within hours. A human newborn can't even hold up its own head. We even have physical evidence of this squeeze from the fossil record itself. In 2008, researchers Scott Simpson and Salishi Sima described a roughly 1.2 million-year-old female pelvis unearthed at Gona, Ethiopia, belonging to an early member of our genus, Homo. It was wider than expected for a body that size, a sign that the birth canal had already been stretched about as far as upright walking would allow. The fossil doesn't settle the debate. It just shows how old this exact tension really is. Now picture what that squeeze actually meant on the ground. For a real birth, in a real forager band. There's another detail that makes human birth strange, and it's the one that gets me every time I read about it. In most primates, a baby is born facing forward, toward its mother, so she can reach down and guide it out and clean its airway herself. In humans, because of that same narrow, twisted birth canal, the baby usually rotates and emerges facing backward, away from the mother. That means a laboring woman often can't see or safely handle her own baby as it's born. She needs another set of hands. Trevathan calls this obligate midwifery. Not midwifery in the sense of a professional job title, but in the deeper sense that human birth, structurally, seems to have required assistance for hundreds of thousands of years. Someone had to be there, not as tradition, as anatome. So who was that someone? This is where the picture gets less lonely than most dramatizations of prehistory suggest. Researchers Kristen Hawkes, James O'Connell, and Nicholas Blurton Jones studied the Hadza, a foraging community in present-day Tanzania, to understand a puzzle. Why do human females routinely live decades past menopause, when almost no other mammal does? It's worth pausing on something important here. The Hadza are not a window into the Stone Age. They are a contemporary people living modern lives, and anthropologists study them as a useful comparative case, not as living fossils frozen in time. With that caveat in place, their research pointed toward what's now called the grandmother hypothesis. Older women who were no longer bearing children of their own were instead gathering food, watching toddlers, and freeing up younger mothers to have their next child sooner. A grandmother wasn't a bystander. She may have been one of the reasons human reproduction could move at the pace it did. Menopause itself is strange, biologically speaking. Almost no mammals stop reproducing decades before they die. The rare exceptions are a handful of whale species, including orcas, where researchers have documented the same pattern. older females who no longer breed, but continue leading and feeding the group for years afterward. Finding that same oddity in whales and in humans, two lineages that split apart tens of millions of years ago, is one of the stronger pieces of evidence that stopping reproduction early carried some real advantage, rather than being just a random quirk of aging. Anthropologist Sarah Blaffer Hardy pushes this idea further in her research on what she calls cooperative breeding. Her argument, laid out across decades of work, is that human infants, because they're born so undeveloped and need so much care for so long, likely couldn't have survived on a mother's effort alone. Aunts, older siblings, grandmothers, and unrelated group members probably all shared the load of keeping a single infant alive. That helplessness didn't end at birth. It stretched on for years, and it shaped how often a woman could have another child at all. Biological anthropologist Tanya Smith and her colleagues found a way to read this directly out of ancient teeth. In a 2018 study, her team traced fine growth lines inside fossil molars, matched against a chemical marker called barium that spikes in a baby's teeth while nursing and drops once it's weaned. Applied to a Neanderthal child's tooth, the pattern showed nursing continuing for roughly 2.5 years, with breast milk still supplementing the diet even after that. 2.5 years of nursing, on top of an infant that couldn't walk, talk, or feed itself for most of that stretch, meant a mother's body and her time were both tied up for a long while before she could realistically support another pregnancy. Anthropologists Kim Hill and Magdalena Hurtado documented something similar, working with the Ache, a present-day forest-dwelling people in Paraguay, whose long-term demographic records show birth intervals commonly stretching past 3 years. Again, the Ache are contemporary people, living present-day lives, studied here purely as a demographic comparison, not a snapshot of the deep past. So let's reconstruct a moment. A woman goes into labor at camp. She isn't alone in a hut, gritting through it in silence. An older woman, perhaps her own mother, kneels behind her. Other women keep the fire going. Keep older children fed and out of the way. Keep watching the tree line for anything dangerous. The baby is born facing away from its mother, into someone else's waiting hands. Within hours, that infant already has more than one person invested in whether it survives the week. An older sister might be sent to fetch water. Someone else quietly starts preparing softer food for the coming weeks, something an exhausted mother won't have to chew and pre-soften herself between feedings. None of this required a plan drawn up in advance. It simply required enough people nearby who had done this before. Here's where popular imagination usually gets ancient life wrong. The cartoon version has a brutish man clubbing a woman and dragging her off by the hair, as though prehistoric mating was pure force and nothing else. There's no solid archaeological or genetic evidence for that scene. It's a joke that outlived its shelf life. What the actual evidence shows is messier and more debated. Some anthropologists argue early humans leaned toward long-term pair bonds, citing patterns in shared parental investment and skeletal evidence of paired burials at some sites. Others argue mating arrangements were far more flexible and varied enormously by region, resource pressure, and group size, and that no single natural human mating system existed at all. Biological anthropologist Helen Fisher has proposed that attachment and romantic love may be tied to specific brain chemistry shaped by evolution, rewarding pair bonding long enough to raise a helpless infant. It's a compelling idea, but it remains one hypothesis among several, not a settled account of how every ancient human related to a partner. Be wary of anyone who tells you evolution mandated a tidy nuclear family. The evidence points toward variation, not a single script. Part of the disagreement comes down to how thin the evidence actually is. We have no recordings, no diaries, nothing but bones, tools, and the occasional grave. When archaeologists find two adults buried side by side, some read that as a pair bond preserved in death. Others point out that shared burial could just as easily reflect kinship, status, or circumstance, with nothing to say about who slept where or with whom while they were alive. This is exactly the kind of gap where honest research says we don't know, rather than filling in a tidy romance. What does look consistent across a wide range of sites and time periods is how expensive a single surviving child actually was. Skeletal studies of ancient populations show markers of nutritional stress in young children, evidence that childhood itself was a gauntlet, not just infancy. Getting a child to adulthood wasn't a private family project. It was closer to a group investment, spread across however many hands a band could spare. That's the counterintuitive twist here. We tend to picture ancient parenting as isolated and harsh, a mother alone with her baby against the world. The research suggests something closer to the opposite. Birth and infant survival were often communal by necessity, not by choice, because the biology simply didn't work any other way. Which brings us to now. Most modern parents in wealthy countries bring a newborn home to a quiet house, sometimes with a partner, often without a wide circle of daily hands-on help. A nurse hands you the baby, someone drives you home, and then the door closes. Postpartum support has become something you schedule and often pay for. A lactation consultant here, a night nurse there, rather than something that simply shows up because the survival of that infant used to be everyone's problem at once. That's not a claim that ancient life was easier, or that modern parents are somehow doing it wrong. Childbirth still carries real risk today, and by most estimates, ancient infant and maternal mortality were far higher than anything typical in a modern hospital system. Nobody should romanticize a version of birth without antibiotics, blood transfusions, or emergency surgery. But the isolation many new parents describe now, the sense of being handed a fragile, demanding creature and largely left to manage alone, is, in evolutionary terms, a genuinely unusual arrangement. For most of the time humans have existed, that isolation would have been almost unthinkable. There would always have been another set of hands within earshot, whether or not anyone ever asked for them. For most of the time our species has existed, no one gave birth entirely alone, and no one raised a child entirely alone either. You feel your body change long before anyone explains why. For nearly all of human history, whatever came next never happened to just one person.